What if the year isn't 2025? What if our calendars are lying to us, hiding nearly 3 centuries of time that never existed? It sounds impossible, but the idea was born not in some secret archive or hidden vault. It rose in the late 20th century Germany. The man behind it was Heribert Illig, a historian who specialized in early medieval Europe and who began to notice odd gaps in the timeline. By the 1980s and 90s, the so-called Dark Ages were already under scrutiny. Historians had long described them as a period of stagnation, centuries where Europe seemed to lose its way after the fall of Rome. Great cities crumbled into villages, monumental architecture slowed, written records thinned out. Compared to the grandeur of antiquity or the dynamism of the Renaissance, the early Middle Ages looked strangely empty. Illig wasn't the only one who thought so, but he went further than anyone else. He believed those empty centuries weren't just poorly documented. They never happened at all. The fuel for this suspicion came from something deceptively mundane: the calendar. For centuries, Europe had followed the Julian calendar, introduced under Julius Caesar in 45 BC. But over time, astronomers noticed it was slightly off. By the 1500s, the calendar no longer aligned with the solar year, a problem that Pope Gregory XIII sought to fix in 1582. His reform, the Gregorian calendar, skipped 10 days to realign time with the equinox. But to Illig, this correction didn't add up. He argued that if the Julian calendar had been in use for as long as history claimed, it should have been off by 13 days, not 10. Where, he asked, did those 3 missing days go? His answer: they represented nearly 3 centuries that had been artificially inserted into history. According to Illig, the years 614 to 911 AD were fabricated, and the culprits, he claimed, were none other than powerful rulers: Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and possibly Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, who, for reasons of prestige and politics, had altered the calendar to place Otto around the symbolic year 1000 AD. If Illig was right, then history itself had been forged. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the late 5th century, Europe was left in ruins. What had once been a continent tied together by Roman law, Roman roads, and Roman legions fractured almost overnight. In place of emperors came warlords, provinces dissolved into kingdoms, and the great cities of stone and marble, once symbols of Roman might, slipped into disrepair. Historians describe what followed as the Dark Ages, not because the world was plunged into literal darkness, but because the historical record itself grew dim. Buildings were smaller, simpler. Trade routes that once stretched across continents fell silent. Literacy became confined to monasteries. For nearly 2 centuries, the beating heart of civilization seemed to fade to a faint pulse. For ordinary people, life was short and uncertain. Villages dotted the landscape where Roman cities once thrived. Diseases swept through with little resistance. Crops failed, famine struck, and wars between rival tribes turned farmland into battlegrounds. Survival came first. Culture, innovation, and progress came second, if at all. The one constant through the chaos was the Christian church. When kings rose and fell, when borders shifted like sand, the church endured. It became the fragile thread binding Europe together. Monks and scribes preserved ancient texts by hand. Bishops held influence that rivaled rulers. Cathedrals and monasteries rose where Roman forums once stood, casting faith as the new foundation of authority. This was the official story of Europe between the years 500 and 700 AD, a continent caught in limbo, adrift between the fall of Rome and the rise of something new. But out of this uncertainty, a figure would emerge, a king who would bring order to the chaos, unite kingdoms under his banner, and forge an empire that could rival Rome itself. His name was Charlemagne. By the 8th century, Europe was still fractured, but power was shifting. Among the scattered kingdoms of the Franks, a group of Germanic peoples, one dynasty began to rise above the rest, the Carolingians. From this family came a ruler whose name would echo across history, Charles the Great, or as we know him, Charlemagne. Charlemagne inherited a kingdom, but he wanted an empire. Through relentless campaigns of war and diplomacy, he expanded his rule across much of Western and Central Europe. Saxons, Lombards, Avars, tribe after tribe fell before him. By the end of his reign, his dominion stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube, from the North Sea to Italy. No one had controlled this much of Europe since the days of Rome. On Christmas Day, in the year 800 AD, the Pope himself placed a crown on Charlemagne's head inside St. Peter's Basilica. The act was more than ceremonial. In that moment, Charlemagne wasn't just a king. He was proclaimed Emperor of the Romans, reviving a title thought long dead. To the Church, this made him the defender of Christendom. To his people, it made him a new Caesar. And to later historians, it marked the birth of what would become the Holy Roman Empire. But Charlemagne wasn't just a conqueror. Under his rule came what is often described as the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of art, learning, and administration in a time when Europe desperately needed it. Schools were founded, Latin texts recopied, and scholars from across the continent were invited to his court. The image that survives is of a warrior king who could crush his enemies, yet also valued the preservation of knowledge. Charlemagne's reign is often cast as the turning point of the Middle Ages, the bridge between the chaos after Rome's collapse and the Europe that would later flourish in the High Middle Ages. He became not just a ruler, but a symbol, the man who proved that empire could rise again from the ashes. But what if that symbol was never real? What if Charlemagne, the king, the emperor, the so-called father of Europe, was nothing more than a legend written into history books centuries after the fact? That is exactly what the phantom time hypothesis dares to claim. While Europe clawed its way out of the shadows, the rest of the world was anything but stagnant. Far to the east, the Tang dynasty was guiding China into a golden age. Their empire stretched from Central Asia to the Pacific coast. Their capital of Chang'an was one of the largest cities on Earth, and their scholars were advancing astronomy, poetry, and technology at a pace unmatched in Europe. Paper money, woodblock printing, even the compass, innovations that would one day transform the world, were already stirring in China during this period. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the Islamic caliphates were rising with unprecedented speed. From the Arabian Peninsula, Islam spread outward, establishing empires that became centers of science, mathematics, and architecture. Baghdad, under the Abbasid Caliphate, grew into a hub of learning where scholars preserved ancient Greek texts and pushed new discoveries in medicine and astronomy. Their influence extended across North Africa, into Spain, and deep into Asia. Across the Atlantic, the Maya civilization still thrived in Mesoamerica. They built towering pyramids, tracked the movements of the stars with astonishing accuracy, and devised one of the most sophisticated calendars in human history. Their cities rose from the jungles, living testaments to a culture flourishing on the other side of the world. Taken together, these civilizations paint a picture of a world in motion, While Europe appeared to stumble in the so-called Dark Ages, other regions surged forward, and that contrast has long reinforced the traditional timeline. The idea that history across continents was unfolding in sync. This is the accepted version of events, the official story. A fractured Europe struggling through the shadows, awaiting the rise of Charlemagne, while beyond its borders, empires flourished. But if Heribert Illig was right, if nearly 3 centuries of European history were fabricated, then what does that say about China's Golden Age, the rise of the caliphates, or the achievements of the Maya? Were they all part of the illusion? Or does the phantom time hypothesis collapse under the weight of these global parallels? The answers, Illig insisted, could be found in the evidence. Heribert Illig didn't just throw out speculation. He laid out a case he believed could stand against centuries of accepted history. To him, the truth was hidden in the details, the cracks most people overlooked. His argument rested on 4 main pillars. The calendar problem. It began with something deceptively simple: the calendar. For over 1,600 years, Europe followed the Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BC. But the Julian year was slightly too long, by about 11 minutes. That error might sound trivial, but over centuries, it added up. By the time of Pope Gregory XIII in the late 1500s, the calendar no longer matched the solar year. So in 1582, the Pope issued a fix: the Gregorian reform. 10 days were skipped. People went to bed on October 4th and woke up on October 15th. Time itself had jumped forward. To most historians, this was simple correction. To Illig, it was a red flag. He argued that if the Julian system had truly been in place for over 1,600 years, the discrepancy should have been 13 days, not 10. As proof, Illig used his calculations: 1 day of drift every 128 years, multiplied from Julius Caesar's time to the 1500s. By that math, the calendar should have been 13 days off, but it wasn't. His conclusion was simple. The 3 missing days represented 297 missing years. To him, those years were not real time. They were invented. The archaeological silence. Illig also pointed to what he described as a dead zone in the archaeological record. Between the years 614 and 911 AD, he claimed, there was an eerie lack of progress. Few grand monuments, little technological innovation, almost no architectural breakthroughs. For nearly 300 years, Europe seemed to stand still. Yes, manuscripts existed, but mostly copies of older texts. Yes, buildings were constructed, but nothing compared to the scale of Rome or the Gothic cathedrals that would follow. Illig painted this period as a cultural vacuum, a flat line on the pulse of civilization. To him, it wasn't just stagnation, it was absence, a gap that didn't mark centuries lived in silence, but centuries that had never existed at all. For proof, he highlighted the absence of major architectural achievements or distinctive artifacts tied specifically to those centuries. Where Rome had aqueducts and amphitheaters, and the later Middle Ages had cathedrals and fortresses, the years between seemed barren. To Illig, this wasn't stagnation. It was evidence those centuries had been fabricated. His conclusion was that what archaeologists call the early Middle Ages was little more than an invented placeholder inserted into the record. The myth of Charlemagne. At the center of Illig's hypothesis was one of the most celebrated rulers in European history, Charlemagne, the warrior king who united Europe, revived learning, and was crowned emperor in the year 800 AD. the man remembered as the father of Europe. Illig suggested that this figure was too convenient to be real. Charlemagne's reign sounded like a myth made flesh, the perfect conqueror, the perfect ruler, the man who appeared out of the Dark Ages to bridge Rome and the Middle Ages. His empire, Illig argued, was an invention of later rulers who needed a heroic foundation for their own legitimacy. As proof, he pointed to the suspicious timing of Charlemagne's story. Many of the chronicles that described him were written decades after his supposed reign. His achievements, vast conquests, sweeping reforms, a cultural revival, seemed too idolized, more like propaganda than fact. Illig's conclusion was stark. Charlemagne wasn't a man at all, but a legend deliberately planted into the timeline. His empire was less a historical reality and more a political invention. The conspiracy of power. But if nearly 300 years were forged, who would benefit? Illig pointed to a conspiracy at the highest levels of medieval Europe. His theory named Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and possibly Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII as the architects of the deception. Their goal, he argued, was to reshape history so that Otto's reign would fall neatly around the symbolic year 1000 AD. The perfect number, a divine milestone, a claim to power anchored not just in politics, but in the very fabric of time. By backdating history, they could compress the chaos of the post-Roman world, insert an invented age of Charlemagne, and emerge as rulers ordained by destiny. To Illig, it was the ultimate propaganda tool, not rewriting chronicles, but rewriting centuries. Illig pointed to the symbolic nature of the year 1000 as proof of motive. For a ruler, it was the ultimate stage, to be seen as divinely chosen to govern in the first year of a new millennium. Taken together, these claims painted a radical picture, a calendar that didn't add up, a gap in the archaeological record, a mythical emperor at the center, and a conspiracy of rulers bending history to their wills. This was the evidence Heribert Illig presented to the world, not just errors in history, but proof, he argued, that time itself had been manipulated. But evidence is only one side of the story. The question that follows is whether it can withstand scrutiny. And that's where the counter-arguments begin. Illig's theory rests on four pillars: the calendar, archaeology, Charlemagne, and conspiracy. But when historians, scientists, and archaeologists tested each of these claims, they found the foundations weren't nearly as solid as Illig believed. One by one, the supposed cracks in the timeline began to close. Illig claimed that the Gregorian calendar reform in 1582 corrected only 10 days, when he argued it should have corrected 13. Proof, in his mind, that 297 years had been fabricated. But astronomers point out Illig's math was flawed. The Julian calendar drifts at a rate of 1 day every 128 years. By the time of Gregory's reform, that meant the calendar was off by just under 10 days. Exactly what was corrected. The 3 missing days weren't missing at all. The strongest evidence doesn't come from paper calculations, but from the skies. Astronomical events recorded in antiquity and the Middle Ages, solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, comets, planetary alignments, can all be checked against modern science. For example, Chinese astronomers recorded a total solar eclipse in July 762 AD, a date that also appears in Islamic records and European chronicles. Modern astronomy confirms that eclipse occurred exactly when and where they described it. If nearly 300 years were fabricated, those observations would be impossible. The stars themselves disprove Illig's claim. Illig pointed to a supposed vacuum between 614 and 911 AD. Too few artifacts, too little progress. To him, that meant centuries that never existed. But archaeology paints a different story. Coins from the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries have been unearthed across Europe, stamped with the names of rulers like Offa of Mercia in England and Pepin the Short in Francia. These coins are not later forgeries. Their metallurgy, style, and wear all match the centuries Illig rejected. Architecture also bridges the gap. Early medieval churches such as St. John's Basilica in Germany and structures in Anglo-Saxon England have been dendrochronologically dated to precisely the Phantom period. Manuscripts like the Book of Kells in Ireland, created around 800 AD, are masterpieces of art and theology that could not have appeared out of thin air. And then there is dendrochronology itself. Tree ring records provide an unbroken timeline stretching back thousands of years. Samples from wooden beams, dated year by year, show continuous growth across the very centuries Illig claimed did not exist. Nature itself testifies to their reality. Illig's boldest claim was that Charlemagne, the so-called father of Europe, never existed, that he was nothing more than a legend written into history. But the evidence for Charlemagne is overwhelming. His court scholar Einhard wrote a detailed biography, Vita Caroli Magni, based on his personal experience of the emperor's life. Legal decrees, known as capitularies, issued under Charlemagne's authority, survive in archives. Coins bearing his likeness were minted and circulated across his empire, many of which survive today in museum collections. And then there's the Aachen Cathedral, also known as the Palatine Chapel, commissioned by Charlemagne himself. The wooden beams in its construction have been dendrochronologically dated to around 792 AD, squarely within Illig's Phantom centuries. You can still walk into it today, a physical, immovable refutation of the idea that Charlemagne was merely a myth. If Charlemagne was invented, then coins, charters, chronicles, architecture, and even foreign records, Byzantine and Islamic sources mention him, all had to conspire in perfect harmony. For historians, that's far less believable than the simpler conclusion. Charlemagne was real. Finally, Illig accused Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and even Byzantine rulers of conspiring to insert centuries into the timeline, placing Otto's reign around the year 1000. A bold theory, but one that unravels under scrutiny. To fabricate centuries in Europe would not have been enough. Civilizations far beyond Europe would have had to alter their histories too. In Tang Dynasty China, astronomers were recording eclipses and planetary movements with astonishing accuracy, data that perfectly matches modern calculations. In the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad's scholars were producing breakthroughs in mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. In the Americas, the Maya were tracking the stars and carving records into stone. All of these timelines, Chinese, Islamic, European, Maya, align across the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. To believe Illig's conspiracy, one must believe that these civilizations, separated by oceans, language, religion, and often hostility, all coordinated to fabricate centuries in perfect synchronization. The scale of deception required makes the theory collapse under its own weight. Illig's phantom time hypothesis relies on suspicion, gaps, and convenient patterns. But the counter-evidence comes from multiple directions: astronomy, archaeology, manuscripts, and architecture. Each line of evidence points to the same conclusion. Those centuries happened. And yet, despite the weight of proof, the theory refuses to die, because while the facts may debunk it, the idea itself carries a strange, unsettling power. Even after historians dismantled the phantom time hypothesis, it continues to draw people in, not because the evidence is strong, but because the idea itself is intoxicating. It taps into something primal, the fear that time, history, and memory are not as reliable as we believe. And that fear links it to other theories that question the way history is told. The appeal of a false history. At its heart, the theory survives because people want to believe that history can be falsified. There's power in imagining that our calendars, our timelines, and even our sense of identity are fragile, subject to manipulation. It's not just about missing centuries, it's about the unsettling possibility that we're living inside a story designed by others. And that story has been accepted for so long that few ever think to question it. When you zoom out, the phantom time hypothesis is less about medieval Europe and more about control. If you can manipulate history, you can manipulate the present. And if you can manipulate the present, you can dictate the future. Time slip theories, the stretched dark ages. Not every skeptic believes 3 whole centuries were invented. Some suggest something subtler, that the Dark Ages weren't fabricated, but stretched. The idea is this. When chroniclers of later centuries looked back at the chaotic years after Rome's collapse, they faced a problem. Records were sparse, rulers were fragmented, and events blurred together. To impose order on the chaos, they may have unintentionally expanded the timeline, turning a few generations of confusion into centuries of supposed history. In this view, history didn't lose 300 years. It gained them, not through conspiracy, but through human error. Think about it. Scribes copying manuscripts could easily misinterpret dates, confuse rulers with similar names, or duplicate stories. A war recorded in one chronicle might be retold in another, but with the name slightly altered, transforming a single conflict into 2 separate ones. Lineages could be extended artificially, each generation elongated to fill gaps no one really understood. One version of this theory suggests that much of the early medieval period was padded by mistakes in genealogy. Kings were said to have reigned for decades when perhaps they ruled only a handful of years. Dynasties were artificially lengthened, and because later historians took these accounts as fact, the errors multiplied. This could explain why the so-called Dark Ages feel so stagnant. It's not that nothing happened, but that events were stretched, slowed down on paper. Innovations, wars, and cultural shifts that might have unfolded over 150 years were smeared across 300, giving the illusion of centuries of silence. It's a haunting possibility, because it doesn't require a grand conspiracy. It doesn't demand popes or emperors falsifying centuries. Instead, it paints history itself as vulnerable to human error. The mistakes of scribes, the assumptions of chroniclers, the misreadings of later historians. Over time, those errors calcified into the official record. So maybe the Dark Ages weren't dark because nothing happened, but because our lens of history distorted them into something they were not. Modern speculation, time, simulation, and reality. In the 20th and 21st centuries, new kinds of speculation emerged. Some theorists argue that what Illig identified wasn't fraud, but a clue that time itself may not be stable, that history could slip, glitch, or bend in ways we don't fully understand. Enter the simulation theory, the idea that reality itself could be a program, and anomalies like phantom time are the equivalent of bugs in the code. If our perception of time is filtered through a system, what seems like a fabricated 3 centuries might simply be an error in processing. Others point to human memory. On an individual level, memory is fallible, subject to distortion, bias, and erasure. Could entire civilizations experience the same? Could cultural memory be just as vulnerable? Events remembered incorrectly, decades telescoped into centuries, or whole narratives erased from the collective mind? What Illig really left us with is not a theory, but a thought experiment. If 3 centuries could be fabricated, or stretched, or misremembered, what else in history could be? Could the Renaissance have been less of a rebirth and more of a strategic rebranding? Could the glory of Rome have been amplified beyond reality? Could entire cultures have been erased, their achievements buried or absorbed into the stories of more powerful empires? Once you allow for the possibility of one illusion, the rest of the timeline begins to wobble. The phantom time hypothesis may not hold, but it opens a door to more dangerous questions. And that's the core of why people can't let it go. History isn't neutral. It's written, rewritten, and often manipulated. Victors preserve what benefits them and discard what doesn't. Whole generations grow up with their past defined by someone else's pen. The phantom time hypothesis is the extreme end of that fear. Not just rewritten chronicles, not just biased accounts, but centuries, invented wholesale, inserted into our calendars, and accepted without question. It's no wonder the theory lingers, because even when disproven, it speaks to something we all know but rarely admit, that what we call history may not always be the truth. Did nearly 3 centuries of the Middle Ages never happen? For historians, the answer is clear. The calendar matches the stars, archaeology fills the gaps, and Charlemagne's empire leaves too much evidence to dismiss. By every measurable standard, those years were real. The phantom time hypothesis collapses under scrutiny. But theories like this aren't just about facts, they're about trust. They remind us that the story of the past is something we inherit, not something we've lived ourselves. We rely on records, interpretations, and the judgment of people who lived centuries after the events they describe. And that makes history vulnerable to bias, to manipulation, even to invention. The phantom time hypothesis may not be true, but it raises a question that's far harder to dismiss. How much of the past do we accept without ever questioning it? If emperors, popes, or kings had reason to alter the timeline, how would we know? We look at the date every day without hesitation. We sign our names under it. We organize our lives by it. But what if the number on the calendar is a lie? Maybe the real mystery isn't whether we're living in 2025 or 1728. Maybe it's whether we'll ever truly know the difference.